Under the relentless July sun of 1762, a wooden rice chest sat quietly in the courtyard of the Korean royal palace. It was no larger than a shipping trunk, sealed tight with ropes and iron nails inside. The Crown Prince of Joseon, 31-year-old Yeongjo, known to history as Prince Sado, was dying slowly, minute by minute, breath by strangled breath. There was no sword, no public execution, no decree read aloud. His crime was never announced. His screams, though, echoed through the palace walls for days. And the man who ordered his death, who turned his own son into a ghost, trapped in a box, was the king himself. To the court, it was a necessary silence. To the public, it was never spoken of. But behind the manicured rituals of dynastic power, this was a collapse in plain sight. Sado had once been the heir to the kingdom's future, a boy born into sacred duty, raised under the gaze of a father who believed perfection was the only proof of worth. As a child, Sado was educated 14 hours a day, then berated in front of scholars for the smallest stumble. When droughts ravaged crops or floods destroyed villages, the king blamed his son's poor moral character, convinced the gods were punishing them for Sado's weakness. That pressure cracked something inside the young prince. Whispers began to spread of hallucinations, of violent outbursts, of servants disappearing from his quarters. Sado's world narrowed into fear, shame, and delusion, and no one dared to intervene. By the time his father made the decision, the court had already cleaned the blood off the tiles too many times. But how do you kill a prince without condemning your grandson? The next in line. The king found his answer not in law, but in an old method of punishment, one not written, but remembered. A sealed chest, placed under the sun, with just enough space for a man to suffocate, not from violence, but from time. Sado wasn't tried, he wasn't defended, he was simply erased, locked away and left to disappear. 8 days later. The silence around the chest matched the silence that followed for generations. But that silence didn't last forever. Crown Prince Sado was appointed heir to the throne at barely 15 months old, destined to carry the legacy of Joseon's monarchy long before he could even walk. The sudden death of his elder brother cast a shadow over the royal lineage, and Sado grew up in the silent, weighty halls of Cheongdeokgung Palace under the stern gaze of his father. King Yeongjo, as a toddler, he was not allowed the simple joys of childhood. Instead, he was thrust into a realm of protocol and ceremony, taught to bow before ministers and recite Confucian classics with a precision that masked his youth. His surroundings were haunted within those palace walls. Tales told of punished concubines, of shamanistic rituals draped in superstition, of whispered warnings hidden in ornate corridors. That fear became his constant companion, crept into his dreams, and followed him at every turn. From the age of 3, he spent upwards of 14 hours a day poring over calligraphy, philosophy, military theory, and history, seated at an ornate desk in a room filled with scrolls. His father watched over this relentless tutoring with unwavering intensity. Any mispronunciation, any error in character strokes, became proof of his son's inadequacy. Ministers and tutors were ordered to correct him publicly, their voices cold and loud through stone halls, their criticisms echoing in the ears of courtiers as though carved in stone. When Sado faltered, he brought shame upon the dynasty. Each flaw was a crack in the facade of imperial perfection. When heavy rains flooded rice paddies or drought withered crops, King Yeongjo would stand upon castle terraces and declared that misfortune was divine retribution for Sado's moral failings. As Sado grew, these messages buried themselves deep within his psyche. The blame for natural disasters and village tragedies lay on his shoulders, as if his every thought could alter the weather or the fate of the kingdom. Soon he began to faint during lessons, overwhelmed by the pressure, his tiny body buckling beneath the weight of unrelenting expectation. These episodes, far from eliciting compassion, prompted more punishment. His collapse was seen as evidence of his weakness, proof that he lacked the fortitude to be king. The punishment escalated longer study sessions, public scolding before visiting envoys, remarks about his unworthiness whispered behind silk screens. Every ounce of affection seemed withdrawn, replaced by a relentless quest to forge him into an unbreakable heir. The court began to murmur. Servants described the prince pacing through candlelit halls at dusk, talking to himself in tones of desperation, muttering syllables in languages no one recognized. Shadows moved strangely in his chambers. Attendants trembled when left alone in the corners of the room. Panic gripped the heart of the palace, but open concern was dangerous. No one dared question the king. Some tried to suggest that the prince rest or receive medical attention, but each suggestion was treated as disloyalty. Those who spoke of his mental strain were silenced, their positions overlooked, their influence quietly erased. The atmosphere grew suffocating. The young prince was trapped in a golden cage, cut off from allies or comfort. Over time, the relationship between father and son became a silent battlefield. King Yeongjo's love was buried under mountains of discipline and shame. Sado's cries for approval echoed unanswered. On one side stood a king determined to forge an heir capable of leading a kingdom through storms. On the other, a son broken by the storms he was supposed to master. The tension in the palace walls grew palpable, a tension held back only by ceremony and decorum. Yet at night, the court heard noises, sobs, muffled shouts, the scrape of furniture dragged across stone floors. The attendants spoke less of the prince's brilliance and more of his tremors, his sudden twitching of the hands, his avoidance of sunlight after midday. He stopped attending certain lessons, preferring darkness and solitude. The silence on his face spoke volumes, an invisible fracture that widened until it could no longer be contained. No chronicler dared record the full extent of the suffering in official journals. Sado appeared dutiful, studious, loyal. But in the back rooms, where ministers whispered in fear, stories spread of a boy who looked unreplaced by a ghost. Eyes hollow, trembling hands clutching forbidden prayers, the combination of isolation, fear, and overwhelming expectation had created a man who was both brilliant in learning and unbalanced in spirit. And as that pressure cooker reached its limit, the stage was set for what came next, a transformation of the palace from a vessel of legacy into a crucible of tragedy. Under the heavy eaves of the royal palace, Crown Prince Sado began to withdraw from the daylight. Servants who once waited outside his chambers described days passing without the sound of movement. Followed by sudden outbursts, objects flung against the walls, guttural screams in the early hours, fragments of words in languages no one around him understood. Somewhere along the strict lines of his royal education, something had fractured. He became consumed by the idea of unseen forces, of symbols hidden in cloth, of divine energies locked in color, number, or gesture. His descent wasn't sudden. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the man the court believed they had raised. The change accelerated when he discovered a forbidden volume of Taoist mysticism, an old text promising protection and power. In its pages, Sado found not comfort, but obsession. The rituals it described became daily fixtures of his life. He would sit motionless for hours, tracing glyphs onto the floor with water, whispering prayers into silk. He claimed he had seen the thunder god in a vision, a being cloaked in lightning who had cursed his blood. From then on, Sado refused to touch objects marked with thunder-like patterns or characters. He feared mirrors and reflections, refused to wear certain colors, and banished fabrics from his presence that shimmered like clouds. Anyone who violated these unwritten rules, however unknowingly, was met not with correction, but violence. What began as rituals of purification quickly turned fatal. A tailor who embroidered a wrong motif onto the prince's robe was struck down with a wooden club. The prince claimed the design invited evil spirits. A laundry maid who returned a garment folded the wrong way was found dead the next morning. Her death, whispered the servants, was no accident. No one spoke of these incidents openly, but the knowledge spread through glances, tightened shoulders, hurried steps. His quarters became zones of absolute control, governed not by palace law, but by the rules in Sado's own mind. He no longer relied on his father's orders or the court's protocol. He acted by impulse, by the flicker of something behind his eyes. Getting dressed became the most dangerous ritual in the palace. Each morning, Sado demanded that dozens of robes be brought to him. He would inspect every hem and sleeve for invisible flaws, sometimes changing outfits 5, 10, even 15 times in an hour. If a seam was off, if a thread resembled lightning, he screamed. Servants who failed to meet his expectations were beaten, strangled, or in some cases, never seen again. Garments were burned in the courtyard in great heaps, watched over by stone-faced guards who had long since stopped asking why. Royal finances began to strain under the cost of his wardrobe, but no one dared challenge the expenses. His violence escalated beyond fabric. He began entering the women's quarters at random, speaking in cryptic tones, demanding confessions of betrayal. A favored concubine named Bing, who had once calmed his storms, became the victim of one. She was killed in a moment of fury over the way her sleeves were folded. Sado washed his hands, changed his robe, and left the room as if nothing had happened. When asked the next day, he claimed she had vanished. The court went silent. Her name was erased from the registry. The murders no longer occurred in secrecy. One summer evening, a eunuch named Kim Han-chai approached Sado to suggest he rest. The prince, pale and twitching from a sleepless week, answered by taking a blade from his robes and cutting the man down where he stood. He then carried the severed head into the inner palace, presented it to the women as a lesson, and left it on a silk cushion. He believed it would ward off spirits. No one touched it until a lower maid, shaking and weeping, was ordered to remove it by nightfall. With each act, the palace grew quieter. No more warnings were issued. Servants moved like shadows, eyes lowered, breath held. The queen and court ministers, bound by tradition and fear, maintained the illusion of order. But Crown Princess Yeongjo, Sado's wife, saw the reality from within every day. She documented the deaths in a ledger she kept hidden in her chamber's dates. Names, supposed causes. She developed a discreet system of compensation, arranging for gold, land, or titles to be given to the families of victims. Funerals were held at dawn, quickly, without records. She paid 3 times the normal wage to anyone willing to serve her husband. Yet even then, most refused. The palace was no longer a sanctuary. It was a place of managed terror. In private, she trained new attendants in how to read the shifts in Sado's mood. They learned to duck quickly, to memorize the placement of objects that might become weapons. They practiced how to respond to seizures, how to clean wounds, how to lie to court officials. The royal physicians arrived too late, too often. Those who survived did so not by chance, but by preparation, and through it all. Yeongjo carried herself with grace, shielding her son, Prince Yeongjo, from the man his father had become. She isolated the boy, protected him from the blood, taught him what was safe to say and what must never be spoken aloud. The palace kept Sado's condition secret. To the outside world, he was still the crown prince. His presence at ceremonies was maintained through clever timing and well-rehearsed appearances. But inside the walls, everyone knew the truth. They had stopped asking whether Sado would inherit the throne. The only question left was how long the court could survive him. The discovery of a forbidden Taoist text marked a crucial turning point in the prince's unraveling. He immersed himself in its teachings, tracing arcane symbols on the floor and whispering invocations that echoed through the corridors at night. He claimed to have seen the thunder god himself, a fearful deity smiling behind flashes of electricity. From that moment, Sado treated every garment, every reflection as a potential gateway to calamity. Colors brought into question, fabrics flagged as cursed, symbols suspected of harboring invisible spirits. The world around him became a labyrinth of peril, and he, the judge of its safety. Every sunrise brought a new ritual of purification. The prince would summon dozens of robes, some stiff with silk, others heavy with brocade for inspection. He would examine hems, hover over seams, trace stitches with trembling fingers. An off-center embroidery or a stray thread could spark rage. Servants who failed this daily ordeal were punished swiftly. Some were beaten, others strangled in moments of blind fury. Scores of outfits burned in the courtyard, leaving charred heaps against marble steps. The royal treasury strained under the cost, yet no one dared question the need. Discipline had been redefined. It belonged entirely to the prince's volatile perceptions. This escalating control extended beyond clothing. Sado claimed that spirits lurked behind locked doors, whispering betrayal through cracked walls. He began wandering into private quarters at odd hours, demanding that palace residents confess hidden sins or suffer spiritual contamination. A trusted concubine who once calmed his storms learned the hard way one wrong move with her sleeves, and she found herself struck down. Sado washed his hands, switched robes, and moved on, as though she had never existed. The court replied with silence. Her official name was scrubbed from records, questions dissolved into uneasy glances. No death went unnoticed for long. One evening, a eunuch offered a gentle suggestion rest. The prince, eyes wild and voice low, said such softness was poison. In a flash, he drew a hidden blade and cut the eunuch's throat. He carried the severed head into the inner court, placed atop a silk cushion as though it were a lesson in divine retribution. It remained there until a trembling maid moved it under orders. The air grew frigid the day the head appeared. No ceremony followed. The act became a legend of fear, whispered in dark corridors where no witness dared speak. The palace, once a center of ceremony and diplomacy, turned into a theater of dread. Official appearances continued, but only in the early hours and under tight guard. News of Sado's breakdown never reached the outer world. Any who questioned the official account, his collapse from illness, faced quiet consequences, forgotten promotions, reassigned duties, exile to provincial outposts. Ministers became hollow versions of their former selves, attending councils by day and leaving the palace before the echo of the prince's footsteps returned at dusk. Inside the inner court, the crown princess maintained a meticulous ledger. She wrote names, times, and fates in her private diary before dawn. Each entry was a dirge rendered in silence for every death. She arranged discreet compensation gold, land, offices delivered in sealed envelopes and carried by servants sworn to secrecy. Burials were arranged at dawn. No public announcements, no mourners. She raised wages for palace workers, hoping enough would accept to survive, but most refused, whispering of curses and shadows. New attendants learned rituals in secret, how to sense mood shifts, how to avert wrath with minimal movement, how to clean wounds and lie to officials. They practiced hushed first aid for unseen injuries, anticipating the next shockwave. The palace physicians were always too late when they arrived. The body was cold, and the story already rewritten. Behind every official smile and every visible ritual, a web of fear stretched across the court. Documents signed at dawn carried weight. Those signed later were ill-fated. Council meetings ended abruptly when Sado entered without invitation. Diplomats tiptoed around his name, avoiding reference to the heir. The capital's merchants passed rumors in hushed tones the prince was possessed. The palace a trap. But all inquiries were deflected. In public, the kingdom remained stable, prosperous, powerful. For Sado's father, the problem grew unbearable. King Yeongjo watched, trapped between paternal love, royal duty, and political necessity. The weight of a kingdom's legacy collided with the pain of a father who saw his son become a monster. The royal family's reputation was at stake, and behind closed doors, the pressure built to explosion. Advisors whispered about exile, exile about punishment, punishment about sanity. But the law provided no solution executing a crown. Prince would destroy more than blood. It would shatter the dynasty's moral foundation. Exile would leave a wounded but dangerous man alive. Attempted cures had failed. The only option left lay outside law and tradition. As the autumn leaves began to fall, the palace stood on a knife's edge. Each breath inside the walls vibrated with uncertainty. Each silent corridor held a secret. Each ritual, prayer, apology, every gesture conducted with desperation, and somewhere in the depths of the palace, the storm within Sado raged on, a torrent no man could stop. Inside the palace, the pressures converged into a single unbearable moment. Reports arrived daily of bodies found in shadowed corridors, of attendants gone missing, of servants trembling at the sound of the prince's door opening. A minister delivered the tally: more than 200 deaths, each a stain the dynasty could no longer ignore. The king paced in his private chambers, leather boots clicking across polished wooden floors, his jade staff clutched in hand. He listened to the voices of advisors discussing exile, mental care, the risk of rebellion. But the rules of Joseon law bound him. A crowned prince could not be publicly executed, especially not by his father. Doing so would mark the dynasty with an indelible stain, a shame that would taint future generations. He looked at the kingdom's map, the provinces laid out like pieces on a board, the famine in the north, the unrest in the south, the courtiers already on edge. Sado's actions had become political landmines. If the throne did not act, rebellion could follow. Yet to act meant destroying his own blood. The weight of legacy pressed down on him. Tradition demanded stability and ritual, not pity. Loyalty lay with the people and with the line of succession. He could not spare the prince without betraying the country, nor could he kill him without fracturing the dynasty's soul. In the dead of night, he summoned his son to the courtyard. A single chest stood beneath the moon, its surface weathered but intact. The prince approached in silence, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. It was not an execution in the legal sense. No edict would be read, no honorable sentence proclaimed. Instead, there was a nod from the king, a signal that words were unnecessary. Guards lifted the chest, a simple wooden box used for storing rice, sealed with nails and ropes, cold metal against flesh, wood against cloth, a coffin without death, a box without burial. The prince climbed inside with stoic resignation, as though he carried the weight of every life lost. The lid closed. 8 days began their slow passage. Every dawn, the courtyard emptied against the sun, the flight of sparrows, the rustle of silk, the scuff of guards' sandals inevitably. The light touched the wood, and for 8 mornings, silence answered where cries should have been, within those slow rotations of day and night. The prince writhed. He choked, pressed his fists against the lid, clawed at the grain of the wood. Each breath became an achievement, each gulp of air a struggle. Water was left outside occasionally, but only those high enough to reach over the rim could wet his lips. He called out once his wife's name, then later his son's. The final cries blurred into rasping gasps, until on the 8th day, only the rustle of fabric remained. And then even that stopped. The chest was removed at dawn. King Yeongjo, eyes averted, left the investigation to guards. They opened the lid. The prince lay curled, hands clutching his chest, fingertips calloused from clawing the wood. His face was still, like porcelain. They carried him away. No dirge was sung, no public ritual held. A statement later read, "He had died of malignant illness." The court bowed publicly. If anyone questioned the official records, they were met with solemn stares or reassigned posts. Silence settled over the palace for weeks. Mourning rites were observed. bells tolled, incense burned. But at night, in private halls behind closed doors, tears were shed for a son, for a prince, for a dynasty. The court rebuilt its performance of normalcy. Council meetings resumed. Envoys were entertained. The capital's markets thrived. No one spoke of the chest. No one mentioned the death. Yet whispers grew. In quiet provinces, villagers told stories of a prince who lived in a cage. Merchants passing through markets spoke of a madness at the heart of royal blood. Over time, the narrative shifted from tragedy to scandal, from scandal to legend. His wife recorded the events in a memoir that would be preserved in closed archives for years, while his son, spared by his grandfather's decision, inherited the throne and quietly began restoring the family's name. In that courtyard, beneath a sun that witnessed a slow death, a dynasty made a choice it could never fully justify. A box was closed, a life extinguished, and a crack opened in the legacy of Joseon that would echo for generations. The cost was never calculated in gold or land, but in the broken silence of a father's love turned fatal, the lost soul of a prince, and a kingdom that had, for one tragic moment, betrayed its own heart. In the years following the death of Crown Prince Sado, the royal court wrapped itself in silence. Official records maintained the illusion of decorum. No ministers spoke of the rice chest. No public mourning ceremonies acknowledged the nature of his passing. The palace returned to its rituals, its layers of protocol and incense, but beneath the surface, the memory of the sealed box refused to die. Though the dynasty had tried to bury its shame beneath legal euphemisms and rigid ceremony, the wound had not closed. It merely changed shape. Behind heavy doors, Lady Yeongjo lived on. She had outlasted her husband, her father-in-law, and eventually, even her son. Her face aged slowly, lined by knowledge she could never share freely. In time, she began to write. Her memoir did not cry for pity. It did not absolve Sado, but in its unvarnished honesty, it broke open the chamber of secrets that had imprisoned her family. She described the madness with clarity. She cataloged the killings, the court's silence, and the unbearable decisions forced upon her. These pages, written in a private hand, would become one of the most intimate and damning documents in royal Korean history. They did not whisper redemption, but they demanded understanding. Her son, Yeongjo, ascended the throne 14 years after Sado's death. He was 10 when the chest was sealed shut. He had been kept far from the courtyard, unaware of the details, only knowing that something irrevocable had been decided without him. As king, he bore the weight of a father denied a dignified death and a grandfather who had ruled with terror and calculation. But Yeongjo did not seek revenge. He sought continuity. He declared publicly that he was the son of Prince Sado, not of a fiction conjured by court scribes. He ordered that his father be posthumously granted royal titles and honors, none of which could undo the final moments inside that box, but all of which marked a break from the silence that had reigned since. Yeongjo's reign brought with it both reform and reverence. His most ambitious project was the construction of Hwaseong Fortress. Built in the late 1790s, its walls stretched nearly 4 miles, a perimeter of stone and intent. Officially, it was a military installation, a modernization of defense, but its placement and its scale whispered something more personal. In its foundation stones and ceremonial gates, historians saw something coded a monument to the father who had been buried without a grave. The structure's geometry, inscriptions, and placement were not random. They aligned with birth dates. With numerology tied to Sado's life, it stood as a disguised tomb, a gesture of memory hidden inside an act of governance. Still, memory is a volatile thing. Outside the palace, stories of Sado's death passed from mouth to mouth. Each retelling changed the angle of the tragedy. Some blamed King Yeongjo, seeing only cruelty. Others saw a madman who had to be stopped. Over time, the legend widened to include whispers of ghosts and curses in certain provinces. Women prayed to Sado not as a prince, but as a spirit who understood suffering. They believed his torment had cleansed him, that 8 days without air or light had burned away his violence and left only the soul of a guardian. He was invoked in rituals to protect victims of domestic cruelty. His name chanted not in fear, but in hope. His story became a parable not of power, but of pain transformed. Shamans began to include Sado in their rites. Offerings of silk and rice were left in shrines dedicated to unquiet spirits, in small corners of the countryside. People built altars where his name was spoken aloud in a way it never could be inside court. These ceremonies were never recognized by law. They existed in shadows, in private devotion, in the gaps where history leaves room for myth. But they grew, and in them. Sado was no longer a prince. He became something else, not ruler, not murderer, not victim, but a being that stood between worlds, bearing witness to the brokenness of both. In modern Seoul, echoes of his story still linger. His final resting place, moved and restored, now bears markers and plaques. Tourists walk its grounds without knowing what passed there. But for those who look closer, the carvings on the stone tell more than lineage. They speak of exile, of silence, of a dynasty built on sacrifice. Sado's name appears in academic texts and spiritual prayers alike. His story, once hidden in royal shame, has become a mirror held up to power. The kingdom did not collapse after his death. No riots followed. The dynasty continued. But something had changed. The act of placing a son inside a box had set a precedent more terrible than rebellion. It proved that even within the most powerful family, the line between duty and destruction could vanish without a trace, and that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy left by the prince in the chest. Not the chaos he caused, nor the silence that followed, but the reminder that behind every banner, every ceremony, and every polished crown, there is a cost that does not fade with time. Beneath the silence of royal records and the polished veneer of dynastic history, the death of Crown Prince Sado remains one of the most haunting shadows ever cast across the House of Yi, not because it marked the fall of a kingdom, but because it exposed the cost of preserving one, a father who ruled with cold reason, a son who unraveled under the weight of inherited expectations, and a family that turned inward rather than face the truth. The box where Sado drew his last breath wasn't just a punishment. It was a symbol of fear disguised as duty, of love buried beneath protocol, and of a nation that chose silence over confrontation. No monument can erase the sound of fists against wood. No posthumous title can undo the days of heat, thirst, and pleading. And yet, his legacy endures not through conquest or law, but through memory. Not a name etched in triumph, but a presence that refuses to vanish. A warning carried forward in whispers, in shrines, in memoirs written behind sealed doors. There is no final judgment in the story of Sado, only fragments of truth, scattered across time like ash. Was he a prince undone by madness, or a victim molded by cruelty? Was King Yeongjo a tyrant, or a man abandoned by every option? But the unthinkable history offers no certainty, only the quiet echo of a chest sealed beneath a summer sky. And the question that still lingers long after what kind of kingdom demands the sacrifice of its own blood to survive